those in that lowest quintile that rate their lives the worst, they are the individuals who are saying that they have more stress, more sadness, more pain, etc. in their daily lives. If we are truly miserable at work, it's not only ruining our lives, it's ruining our lives of our loved ones.
If you're an investor, you probably have some sort of framework or model that you use when you analyze a company as a candidate for an investment. And I'm wondering if you take employee happiness into account. I bet most of you don't, but this is a really, really important metric. So much more important than I ever considered, especially now as we get into a more challenging time in this economy. What brought this to light for me was a book by John Clifton. He's the CEO of Gallup Research. It's called Blind Spot, The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. This book really, really impacted me in ways that I was frankly quite surprised about. So I had to get John Clifton to join us for an in-depth discussion. And that's what you're about to see on this week's Global Macro Update. I hope you enjoy. John Clifton from Gallup, it's great to see you. I want to jump right into it here. This book, Blind Spot, it really it surprised me at how applicable it is to what we do here at Malden Economics every day. We're market and investment research analysts. And there's something in this book that jumped right out at me, and I thought it was smart of you to put it very early on. It's on page 5. It's a chart that shows the global rise of unhappiness. And what struck me about it is it's almost, not 100%, but almost a mirror image of the rise of the stock market over the same period. So we had a period where the stock market went on pretty much an epic run after the financial crisis, and sadly, an epic run in unhappiness. It's the inverse of what I would have expected. Why do you think that is?
Well, I wouldn't make too much about the correlation or alignment with global unhappiness in the stock market. And the reason I would say that is because, if we're just focused on the U.S.'s stock market, the U.S. population is about 330 million. And if you take that divided by 8 billion of the total global population, America makes up only about 5% of the world. So when we're looking at global statistics, it's probably better to start looking at some of the most populous countries in the world, like China and India. But I will say that with respect to the global rise of unhappiness, we do see that it's taking place almost everywhere, almost in exactly the same fashion, which is really fascinating.
And yet, so I understand that point, but at the same time, there's lots of lists and charts in this book. It's packed with data, and there aren't too many lists in the best of categories where the U.S. shows up. It doesn't show up in the worst either, but it's not necessarily a leader in all the metrics you use to measure happiness.
Well, America was once one of the leaders in unhappiness. When we started doing this about 15 years ago, and we asked people if they experienced a lot of stress, anger, sadness, physical pain, and worry, America was tied for 20th. And over the past 15 years, America has slid to 50th. Now, the reason that America has dropped in the rankings of unhappiness is not because America got happier. The reason that America slid in the rankings is because the entire world got so much more unhappy. So it's almost like the rest of the world caught up to America in terms of the amount of stress, anger, sadness, pain, and worry that Americans experience.
Wow. So why don't we start with, let me go back to the basics a little bit. Can you just describe how your firm measures happiness, and if that's even the right word that we should be using?
So the way that we are measuring how people's lives are going is really in two constructs: how people see their life and how people live their life. And the reason that we did this is that leaders right now are still obsessed with indicators like GDP and unemployment that speak to the rational mind of human behavior. But what they don't have are global indicators on how people feel. And ultimately, in terms of our decision making, and this was ultimately what we learned from the discipline of behavioral economics, is that most decision making is not rational, it's emotional. And we don't have any indicators to understand how people feel at a macro level. So 15 years ago, we started out and just asked people, how much anger do you have? How much sadness do you have? We also asked them how much joy they experienced or how much they laughed and smiled. And what we came up with when we first started doing this was kind of something that confirmed conventional wisdom. So, for example, the region of the world that expressed the most sadness, the most anger, was the Middle East, places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that still remains true, but the anger, stress, sadness of the entire world has grown. In fact, we did face-to-face interviewing in Afghanistan while the American troops were leaving. The Taliban allowed women to interview women at this particular time. And what we found is that the stress, sadness, anger, and pain that people were feeling in Afghanistan was not just a record high in the history of our tracking, it was a record high for every single country that we've ever seen. So the pain that people are expressing is very real, and it's something that you can actually quantify.
So, speaking of quantifying, I mean, how do you measure? What do you use to determine if someone is having a good life? And how do you solve for what I would have to think is a pretty subjective process? I mean, you're measuring global unhappiness or happiness, and yet every culture thinks differently, acts differently, values different things. How do you solve for that?
Yeah, so the way that we capture this information, as you mentioned, is through survey research. We ask people. So a lot of times people will criticize this and say, well, how do we know surveys are accurate? And it's often a surprise to them that most of the data they consume is actually conducted by surveys. Take unemployment, for example. So unemployment is, of course, one of the most famous international statistics. And it surprises a lot of people that it's a massive survey. And it takes them about an hour, but they ask people, do you have a job? And the reason that the response rates are so high is oftentimes the government can compel people to participate in those particular surveys. So instead of ask people, do you have a job? We ask them to do two things. One, rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10 on how your life is going. 10 is the best life possible. 0 is the worst life possible. Where do you stand today? And then we also ask them this other side of the ledger on how they're living life, how much stress they have or how much sadness. Now, if you look at the rankings, and this is the reason that both have to be measured, if you look at how people reflect on their overall lives, it's often driven by things like money and career success. Why? Because if you go to the countries where they rate their lives the best in the world, it's often the Nordic countries, Denmark, Switzerland, etc. And when you look at the bottom of that particular list, the people that say that my life is a 2 or a 3 are places like Afghanistan or Haiti or the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it highly correlates with GDP per capita. You can even see this within countries. Rich people rate their lives better than poorer people. But money may buy a better way that you see your life, but it doesn't necessarily buy a better way that you live your life. So in terms of the amount of stress someone feels, after your basic needs are met, more money will not necessarily mean that you'll have less stress in your life or less anger. And this is why we've come out with this book, is because we want to remind leaders that the way to a better life is not just through traditional economic indicators like money and a job. It's also through a subjective lens and the multi sort of understanding of a great life, which is whether or not you have friends, whether or not you have quality friends. And the biggest one, whether or not you have an emotional attachment at work.
That's one of the things that really grabbed me about this book, and it wasn't obvious to me at first. A friend recommended I read it, and I thought, this isn't really what we do, but I'll read it. And it surprised me at how applicable it is. We're coming out of this epic stock market run that we've had. Now we're in a bear market, a big correction in the stock market, and interest rates are going up. Things are going to get a lot harder for businesses, especially businesses that have been able to operate kind of on the margin because they've had access to cheap money. That cheap money's gone away, and now it's going to be harder to pick winning companies if you're an investor. And this level of engagement and happiness is something that I don't know one analyst who factors this in to their model when they're analyzing a business. So could you talk a little bit more about from the business perspective how this factors in and how it really is important to the success of a business?
I think there are 2, possibly 3 indicators I think that investors should be looking at. The first is, of course, the overall, what you could call happiness. We can get into a conversation about how the word happiness is actually measured, or the emotional attachment of their employees. And the second one is the emotional attachment of their customers. And there could be a third, which is the emotional attachment of their suppliers. And I'll start with just a quick story about the relationship with customers, because a lot of times we oftentimes think about a business transaction as completely rational. We think about a business transaction on whether or not the price is right, the product is solid, and whether or not they got their product on time. But again, our decision making is mostly emotional, not rational. We worked with an organization, or at least analyzed an organization. It was a local shop. It was actually here in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown. It was a bakery. And one of their largest customers was a woman that came in. She spent about $100 every single month with them, maybe a little bit more. So over the course of a year, she spent well over $1,000. And for a small shop, that's a lot of money. And one day she stopped coming. They didn't change their product. They didn't change their price. And they didn't change their wait time in their lines. They treated her with disrespect. Now, if she was an automaton, a robot, whether or not she was treated with disrespect wouldn't change her buying behavior. Yet it did, because we're human beings. And I think one of the things that many of us fail to appreciate, and again, we do this because we've been trained in traditional economics. And it wasn't until psychology, Danny Kahneman, who is also a psychologist, looked at economics and said, hey, by the way, human beings are not totally rational. They're also emotional, and it often drives their decisions. And the same is true with employees. So we can see very clearly that if somebody has an emotional detachment, whether or not they've quietly quit or loudly quit, like many on TikTok, that it causes them to work less, that it causes them to, encourage others to work less. And it's really destroys workplaces. And worst of all, it destroys customer interactions and ultimately the bottom line. So from an investor perspective, one of the things, and again, a lot of them are looking at this through ESG metrics, but they're not looking at the right metrics, because a lot of times these are box checking exercises to understand how employees are doing or how customers are doing, or they use a low bar like satisfaction. And that's not right. It's not the right way to do those kinds of analytics. And it also doesn't tap into a human being's emotional mind. So until they do that, they're not truly going to understand the emotional attachment their employees have or their customers have. The last one is suppliers. Supplier engagement surveys are not necessarily done widely across the industry. And the reason for that is when people do ESG reports, the ESG reporting that they're doing is whether or not their suppliers comply with certain rules, whether or not they meet certain diversity requirements, or they just quantify how much money they spend with their suppliers. But nobody asks them how they feel about the organization they work with. And that's a problem, because most mistakes that happen in supply chains are human error. There was one analysis that said that breaks in your supply chain can actually devalue a company by 10%. And those breaks are human errors. They're not really contributed by anything else. And human errors come from emotional behavior, not from rational behavior. Because again, if we were all robots, we would probably act and behave exactly the same way every single day at work. And that's not the case. So I think the failure to truly appreciate this behavioral aspect of the human mind is one of the places that investors, I think, could get a lot better.
Just to ram that point home a little bit, there's a section in your book where you talk about customer engagement, and if the customer feels proud to be a customer of a certain company,
Yeah.
and if they do, you indicated that they're likely to spend well over 20% more with that company. So that's a very meaningful increase in revenues for the company that can build that tight bond with the customer. I found that fascinating.
That's exactly right. And a lot of these things aren't necessarily rocket science. I mean, one organization that we worked with, one thing that just completely changed the relationship with customers is whether or not the employees got to know them by name, and already knew what their orders were before that they came into the place. This is what builds emotional attachment, and I think you could go so far as to say this is what builds communities. So again, I think this is why investors, and I think the business community, although many of them are familiar with it, although many of them actually purchased and read the books that Danny Kahneman had written, many of them aren't actually implementing strategies so that they can tap more deeply into the behavioral economy.
Yeah, just a side note, one of the things I thought you did so well with this book was it's a quick, easy read. but it's the kind of book that if you read it right, you go back and reread parts of it because there's so much data packed in here, and yet you do it in such an approachable manner. It doesn't. I've read some of Kahneman's work, and while I very much appreciate it, you have to have a clear mind, and you have to be ready to do some work yourself to get through it. Whereas this really serves it up for you in an easy way to understand. So I appreciated that. One other point, you mentioned employees. How much does the employee factor in to their own happiness? Because you mentioned, I think you kind of alluded to the quiet quitting trend that's in social media right now, where people are, especially younger people, are saying, just show up when you need to show up, leave the minute that you can leave, don't do anything extra because there's more to life than just work. And while I can understand and appreciate that approach, while you are at work, how you think about it to some extent can impact your own level of happiness. Does that factor into this at all?
Well, I just want to mention one thing quickly about quiet quitting, which is quiet quitting is a new term for an old concept. Because quiet quitting is the concept of not being engaged. It's just doing the minimal amount of work in order to...
Phoning it in, right? We used to call it phoning it in.
Exactly. And so, again, a big aspect of that is whether or not the manager is actually somebody who deeply engages that particular individual, that they care about their individual development. That they actually help them get the things they need in order to do their job, to make sure they know what's expected of them at work, and put them in a position that allows them to do what they do best every single day. So a lot of that, and it's why in our data we find that the variance in terms of an individual's engagement or whether or not they quietly quit is who their manager is. And a lot of times the breakdown in terms of managers is you either pick the wrong one, because there are some people that are not built to be managers. They are built to be individual achievers. And management has known this for a very long time. I think many refer to it as the Peter Principle, but it's still a fact. But the other thing is, a lot of people who do become a manager, they've had the technical training they do in order to have success in their particular role. But what they don't have is the training to be a great manager. They don't know just the very functional aspects about how do you give somebody recognition? What do you do if you have somebody that's coming in persistently late? A lot of times when people hear about that, they go, you fire the person. That's not the right answer. The right answer is you engage in a conversation with them and ask them why they're doing that. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they might be coming in late because they have a child that they have to drop off at school. So there's just a few kind of behavioral nudges that you can give, or learnings that you can do to work with a manager to say, hey, this is the right way to engage people that'll make them feel a lot more excited about showing up at work, than kind of hoping that they'll be identical models of you and how you became successful. Everybody has to learn and grow and develop in their own way. And there are very basic tools that managers can be given, and also, kind of practical learnings to help make them more effective managers. And largely that's absent in a number of workplaces.
So, John, last point. How much does the have versus have-nots sort of phenomenon that I think is very obvious in this country, how much does that play into this? And the reason I ask is, if you look back to the post-World War II era, I'm not saying that was the best time across the board for employees in this country, but it's the time when the middle class really grew and blossomed. And you have that era where you had company towns, where if there was a big employer in the town, your grandfather worked there his whole career, and then your dad worked there, and your goal was to work there, to get in there, get a good job, and they would take care of you. You do a good job for them, and they would take care of you for your life, and you were proud to be in that company. That's a rosy lens view of that era.
Yeah.
But my point is, you almost never hear those stories anymore. We kind of went through the Jack Welch squeeze every dollar phase in this country, and that just seemed to build. We had leveraged buyouts, and now it's all just about squeezing as much money as you can out of an entity, and that's what a business's purpose is to just make as much money as it possibly can. And I think we've really lost something in this country because of that, and it's counterproductive to the ultimate cause, because it doesn't lead to long-term stability of a company. Everything's focused on this quarter's earnings. I don't even know where I'm going with this. I'm on a little bit of a rant here, but back to the haves and have-nots. I mean, does that have a big impact on employee happiness?
It does, without question. And so right now we can see that there is a widening gap between the haves and have-nots of a great life. Now, what does that mean? When we ask people to rate their lives on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 is the best life imaginable, 0 is the worst life. Where do you stand today? 15 years ago when we started doing this, we found that there was about 2.5% to 3% of people that said, my life is a perfect 10. And we found that about 1.5% of people said, my life is a 0, it can't get any worse. Fast forward 15 years later, and the percent of people that say that I have a perfect life has more than doubled, and it's almost 8%. And the percentage of people that say that my life is a 0, it cannot get any worse, has more than quadrupled, also to almost 8%. So the widening of people who say that their life is perfect and those who say that their life is perfectly awful has shifted significantly. And you can see those in that lowest quintile that rate their lives the worst. They are the individuals who are saying that they have more stress, more sadness, more pain, etc. in their daily lives, far more than those that are saying that I have the best life possible. Now, a lot of people say, well, why is it okay for people right now to say that life is so bad when humanity has never had it better than they do now? And you had mentioned before World War II. I think it's easy for people in wealthy countries to say that right now. And the reason I say that is because one of the most concerning trends in our database, which is a database that we are co-producing with the Food and Agriculture Organization out of Rome, is that while the world has won the war against hunger for the past 40 years, we began to lose the war on hunger in about 2014. So the people who say that they are moderately or severely food insecure has increased 50% over that period of time. And it did not just happen in the past 2 years. So for a lot of people, they say, well, this war in Ukraine is actually causing a global hunger crisis. If they think it's what caused it, then they haven't been paying attention. The rise of global hunger has been coming for some years now. So again, I think it's really easy for those in the West to say that, hey, this is the best time ever, because there are people right now who are really struggling in terms of just being able to fundamentally eat. I think it's so bad in Somalia right now because of droughts that there are literally 7 million people who are even worse than severely food insecure. Their food insecurity has gotten so bad, it's the one that's kind of on a red alert right before an individual perishes. So these are really concerning data that I think it's fair for somebody to say that they have more pain potentially in their own life, or pain that is sort of immeasurable for any human being. But I think that in terms of the rising unhappiness that's taking place in other parts of the world, there are two other contributing factors. One is loneliness. 300 million adults globally are totally lonely. They don't have anyone that they can count on or anyone that they talk to on a regular basis. And it's no longer an exaggeration to say that loneliness kills people. An academic at BYU, she did a meta-analysis and found that loneliness increases your chances of dying by 50%. You don't have anyone that you can lean on, but also you don't have anybody looking out for you. There's a really tragic story that took place in the past year in Italy where police were doing random checks because of high winds. They knocked on a woman's door and she didn't answer, and the neighbor said, we haven't seen her in a long time. They went in and checked on her, and she died 2 years previously. She didn't have anyone that just looked out for her. So this kind of tragedy is not just her. It's happening to 300 million adults today. And to make things worse, 20% of adults everywhere don't have anyone in their family or a friend that they can count on in times of need. So it's not just the amount of friends, it's also the quality of friends that's causing concern. And the last one, of course, that we mentioned is the workplace. The amount of time that we spend at work is pretty incredible. One estimate says 115,000 hours. I tried to replicate the analysis. I found at the low end it's 83,000. Either way, the only thing we do more in life is sleep. And so if we spend that much time working, if we are truly miserable at work, it's not only ruining our lives, it's ruining our lives of our loved ones. We did a survey of those that are truly miserable at work and said, does the stress and pain of work cause you to behave negatively with family and friends? And overwhelmingly, they said yes. So this idea that, we can have work-life balance or that we can compartmentalize the pain that's happening at work is just not true. We have to create better workplaces if we truly want to curb the global rise of unhappiness.
John Clifton from Gallup, I really appreciate your time today. Blind Spot, a very important book. I can't recommend it enough. Thanks again.
Ed, thank you for having me.
I'm Ed D'Agostino. Thanks for watching this week's Global Macro Update. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with John Clifton from Gallup. I do really recommend you get the book, Blind Spot. If you have a moment, please click that subscribe button on our YouTube channel. It really helps us out with that YouTube algorithm. We're trying to grow the number of viewers on our channel. And if you want to get an email and a transcript of my interviews with famous people every week, then check the link out in the YouTube description. You can go to the Malden Economics website and sign up for our free weekly email fulfillment of Global Macro Update. Again, I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics. See you next week.